So this is a question that I get asked a lot, especially from people that walk through the game store there in Redlands, Board Game Paradise, which is uh, my sometime uh, sponsor and very good friend, and the place where I run my live games on Mondays and Tuesdays. But the question is, how many games are there? So I'm going to be using some clever game categories that are kind of my own personal words for them. And others are going to be ones you're going to be able to recognize instantly. So we're going to talk about, this is not a complete list. I have to tell you that if I were going to build a complete list, we would be here for another hour or two just going over all of them. So this is going to be my, if you will, my short list of styles of games. And this does not include any of the role play aspects. I know that normally I'm on the role play channels and talking about RPGs and Dungeons and Dragons and the like. Well, today we're going to be talking about all the other kinds of games that are out there. And this is by far not an extensive list, but it is nonetheless my list. So the first thing I'm going to ask about is how many of you have know of any ridimims? And ridimims is an acronym that I came up with, and it kind of describes an entire category of games. Arguably, it's a relatively small category nowadays, but it nonetheless is still found even with new releases year by year. And ridimims are roll your dice, move your mice. Roll your dice and move your mice. Ridimims. So, but a ridimim generally is a game that has a static track, and as you move, you'll have, the closest you'll have to any decisions is the left path or the right path, forward or backward, up or down. Simple, basic concepts like that. But other than that, the die roll is determining where you land each turn. And in most roll your dice, move your mice games, the dynamic that causes the game's changes is when a choice you make puts you in a place where the course you were going to take changes. Chutes and ladders is a great example. Snakes and ladders, I guess, is another name for it. There are dozens and dozens. Candyland is a prime example. And some would argue that Monopoly is, but it's not quite. We'll get to Monopoly in a minute. So I wouldn't consider Monopoly to be a ridimim because the decision-making structure in that case is considerably different from just rolling the dice and then watching where the dice move your figure to. There are some places on the Monopoly board where there is, but generally speaking, you don't have a lot of control. So the next kind of game are chases. And there are a surprisingly large number of chases, even if you're not aware that's what they are. The concept of a chase is found in simple games like Sorry or Trouble or Parcheesi, which are all three fundamentally the same game with slightly different rules, or even arguably simpler games that use multi-piece moving, such as checkers or Chinese checkers, both of which are you're attempting to transit a board from one side to the other, ostensibly to achieve victory, or at least in the case of checkers, to achieve a superior status for your playing pieces. But a chase game is generally, you have a static number of moves that can be made, and the order in which you make them will determine the winner of the overall game session. Both of these are generally on the basic end of games, and many of them are ones that by the time you get to junior high and high school, you've evolved, if you will, past them. But some of them can still be, don't get me wrong, they still can be fun. And there are longer versions of chase games that are still out there. One of my favorites is a game called Mille Bornes, which means 1,000 miles. And it's a French card game. Static number of cards, but you're trying to travel a distance of 1,000 miles. And while it does have some of the more competitive aspects to it, generally speaking, it really is literally still just a chase game. You're just going from one point to the other. Sometimes there are games that have a chase and pursuit aspect. I believe that Sorry is the one that has that. And then there are others that have a move and block chase kind of an element, and I suppose you would consider backgammon to be a multi-piece movement version of that. But all three of those that I've just mentioned, chess, checkers, 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 Sorry, and such, are also considered to be what I consider to be the hallmark of homeroom classics. When I was in school, at least, and this is, granted back before the invention of the light bulb, but the days of the school homeroom was that there were certain games that were privileged to be included in the schoolroom that could be accessed during study periods or whatever. And these included chess, checkers, sometimes backgammon. The concept here is that they are two-player games because generally only one or two people are going to be free in the study hall. And it became a privilege to be able to participate in these. And the idea of the homeroom classic are just those games they're like the equivalent of what comfort food is to diet. They make us feel good, and they are ones that are familiar to us. The rules are relatively simplistic to understand, although obviously complex to master in the case of chess. But the numeric dynamics of the play is promoting educational mental processing, and so therefore schools will generally endeavor to have them available. And they are usually classic in that they don't have a branding or a license or intellectual property. They're just playing pieces in a board. Now, the next group are what I call colloquial favorites. And the reason why I say colloquial is that the same game might have 20 names. I remember when I was a youngster, there was a game that my parents had picked up someplace, and they used what was for us a dirty word when they played the game. It was called spit, for lack of the actual word. And spit was a game where you played, basically each person was attempting to complete a solitaire puzzle and run themselves out of a stack of 13 cards. And the first person out would catch the others with a number of points in their hands equal to the number of cards still in their pile of 13, which they would then have to subtract from the total number of cards they'd played on the table. I'm giving away too much information, but the idea is that these games are colloquial. They're usually quick play. They're usually not necessarily icebreaker because they generally don't have a lot of text. Conversation is part of the game, but they certainly allow for some smack talk and messing with other players and such. And so they are dynamic and usually frenetic in nature. This would also include, I think that now there's a nationally known name of Farkle, but that was called Five Spot, and a bunch of other names in the years when I was growing up. And these were games that I consider them colloquial only because the names were colloquial. The games spread quickly from neighborhood to neighborhood, but they were, I just reversed myself. Let me back up. This is wildfire games. I was ahead of myself. So these are the wildfire games. They don't necessarily have the same name as you go from place to place. They are quick to learn, quick to play. A lot of fun, mechanical, dynamic, challenging, but they don't have a lot of history. And what history they do have will have different names and different terms for it. So now I'm going to go back to colloquial favorites. And when I refer to colloquial favorites, I'm talking about those games that are time-honored, our families have known for years. They might have different names for them depending on where they grew up. uh, games like uh, Standard Rummy, Gin Rummy, Shanghai Rummy, Chicago Rummy. There are alternative forms of bridge such as pitch or pinochle, or numerical games like my personal favorite, cribbage, euchre, whist. There's there's hundreds of games, and they are generally played with a similar or the same set of cards. And the players, once they learn the system, they can play version after version after version. And generally, these are, when I say again colloquial, they become a part of the local fabric. In the case of my parents, coming from the Midwest, the three C's. Yeah, I said three, and there's two I couldn't think of. That's funny. Cribbage, canasta, kings in the corners. There's literally dozens and dozens. At one point, I knew 127 different card games to play, but many of them, to be honest, were games that had only slight nuanced rules and were fundamentally the same. For example, Shanghai versus Chicago Rummy. They're played with the same concept of a progressive objective in scoring, and the only difference between them is the rate of change and the overall points. So I could call it two different games I know how to play, but it's really the same fundamental game. These colloquial favorites they can be in any format. So perhaps it's card games, perhaps it's miniatures, little soldiers. It could be marbles. It could be games like Mancala, where you just dig holes in the ground. These are all colloquial games. As a matter of fact, things like bag toss, bags, whatever they call it in North. The idea of throwing a sandbag, a bean bag through a hole at the other end of a course or whatever. These are all colloquial games, and they are all enjoyable. They play out in 5 to 15 minutes, and you can move on to the next game. And they are basically loved by the locals to that particular style of play. The next are the war game starters, and there are less of these days than there were before. But a war game starter is that one or two of those games that are out there, such as Risk or Stratego, that teach the abstract concepts of military warfare in a competitive but sanitary way. The mechanism of the game is not glorifying in any way the machinations of warfare, but they are representing the sweeping changes to the world that occur because of them. And Stratego is much more of a espionage side of warfare, but nonetheless, it is still the concept of us versus them. It's fundamentally 2 to 4 to maybe 6 players competing for world domination. In the case of Stratego, specifically 2. But the idea of the war game starters is there was an entire generation of games in the 1960s that spawned from our military successes in World War II, and how they translated the mechanistic means of winning that war into game mechanics. The simpler versions, as I said, are Risk or Stratego, but there are many more, slightly more sophisticated ones, such as Attack, or oh gosh, what's the other one? There's a lot. World in Flames, if you're looking at a miniatures property that is also a beginning war game. Axis and Allies, that was the other one. Axis and Allies is a kind of a grown-up brother to Risk. So these are, even though the level of Axis and Allies is considerably more sophisticated than Risk, nonetheless, it is still a starter compared to much more sophisticated war games, such as Atlantic Wall or Iron Cross of Iron, or no, there's dozens and dozens. But the starters themselves are lighter fare, and you're more likely to run into those in the localized area. The next kind of games are ones that we talked about just a moment ago, and these are the icebreakers. These are generally games where the players interact and share information about the games, about themselves while they're playing. So you learn a little bit about the personality, you learn about their sense of humor, you learn a little bit about maybe where they're from, and this kind of things as all part of the concept of breaking the ice or getting to know each other a little bit. And therefore they are usually fairly short. You're talking 15 minutes to an hour maximum to play through one of the icebreakers, usually less than that, and they're therefore repeatable. You can play them more than once just to get familiarized with each other and the rules and the propriety of how to play games. Beyond this, you also have I need to know if you've ever played any simulators. And most people would think simulators means I'm talking about a computer program that's going to emulate something in real life. And no, in this case, the simulation game is one where the rules are intentionally arbitrary and that the play is defined. Therefore, the players don't have a lot of agency. And a great example of this is the game Monopoly. Most of us have played it, didn't realize it was a simulation compared to a game, because it does create some semblance of life, but in reality, we don't, other than metaphorically, we don't walk around in a circle. And yet the Monopoly board is just that. It's simply a squared out circle. And therefore you are hitting the same specific places time and again without any control on your part, and therefore there's no real agency to it. And thus it's an economic simulator with some fallacies built in. The lore on it, I could go into it at a later time, but the lore of Monopoly is such that it's intended to prove that capitalism is bad and that people who have to win at Monopoly are jerks and that capitalism just is a failed experiment. But we'll deal with that later. There are other simulator games out there. Game of Life. There are several rhythms that are like them as well, where you're following a path, but you get to choose direction. And Life has a little bit of that, and games like Barbie. There's several other different board games that have this mechanism that actually are just a simulator for some economic structure or some communications engine. Now, the next category is probably one of the largest, and these are party games. And a party game is something that's going to take between 30 minutes and an hour and a half, and is going to be playable by 4 to 6 to even 10 players. And it's going to pit them team versus team with some skill involved, whether it be memory, whether it be drawing, for example, like in Pictionary, or maybe it's based on nimbleness. All of these types of party games are meant to just be a lot of fun with a large group of people. The score isn't supposed to have as much meaning. It isn't going to determine how you feel about the night, whether you won or lost at the party game. And because of the fact that it does have to do with skill, you can somewhat admire the people that do succeed in the game. And if that's you, awesome. And if it isn't, awesome. It's whoever had the best skill at that moment. And party games also tend to be short enough that in a average get-together, you can play anywhere between 2 and 5 party games. They aren't crunchy, they're not clunky. The rules are quick to pick up, and you're just able to get going right away. Of course, then when people think of party games, they think of partying, and so therefore, of course, there is an entire subsection of games known as drinking games. And generally, these are ones that give specific rules for when you must drink, so to speak, in a competition, or in other cases, you have to refrain from drinking while somebody else has to, and so therefore, it's a way to give yourself permission for some level of inebriation. Now, I tell you that I like a lot of the drinking games, but I almost always play them with a different set of rules and no alcohol. We play instead that we play until you have to be the first one to run to the bathroom, and then the game's over when the first person has to go running. So that can be fun too. If you sat there and drank, you have now imbibed your third Mountain Dew, and your parents told you only two. And yes, so drinking games among youngsters, if they're using alternate rules where it has no alcohol in it, they're a lot of fun. But adults, within reason, of course, can enjoy adult beverages and have a great time with drinking games. There are some of them that are pretty racy and have a lot of innuendo and nuance and things like that draw the players in for more of a visceral play experience. So I'm not going to go into them in particular detail, but then we get to what I call the big two. And the big two are main attractions and crunchy marathons. A main attraction game is a medium crunchiness 2 to 4 hour board game. These are what everybody came to play. If you have seen games, there are names out there like Wingspan and Scythe and 100 and others that are out on Kickstarter that are dropping all the time. And these board games tend to be on the moderately crunchy level. They have some serious visual appeal, either by having miniatures or having terrain or map features. They're all usually well designed and well made, but they do have a longer playish time, and that longer time does preclude other games. And that's why they're considered to be the main attraction. If you're getting together to play a game of Scythe, it's a 4 or 5 hour game, so you're not going to be playing that and something else. You're going to be, getting right to business as quickly as you can. And then finally, the really big monsters are known as crunchy marathons. And this is modern terminology, and I'm old, so I'm probably going to be castigated for my terms here. But the idea here of a crunchy game session is that it is a game that has a large number of rules, generally with considerable nuance. It does take a lot of discussion and a decent player knowledge base that the consumer has to go through, and therefore the idea of a crunchy marathon is it's going to be 4 to 6 to 10 hours to play through, and so you don't undertake one of these at a whim. And so once you start to understand what games are out there and what the terms mean and what the game represents, you can choose appropriately for whatever game event you're hosting, so that your players will feel a part of the community and they'll understand going into it what they can expect from your game sessions. So that is the 3 sections that I wanted to get through for today. I'm getting done about the same time, about 44 minutes, so that is great. If you have any questions, of course, feel free to reach me through the chat box here in Facebook during the hours that I'm here, or of course over at YouTube in the comments section. We are at NycosRPG in both cases, so just go to either one and search at NycosRPG, and you'll be able to find us, so you can watch the videos and whatever. If you've enjoyed what you've seen, make sure that you follow this channel here on Twitch, and like the channel over at YouTube, so that we can keep giving this information to more people and the audience can find us. If you have any other questions, of course, you can PM them to me directly, and let me share with you our other information. If you want to know more about the NycosRPG mechanism itself, you can check out the product info and more at NycosRPG.com. Also, over at NycosRPG.info is the story, lore, and game information about the campaigns that I run each week in roleplay games. I'm currently up to 7 game sessions per week, so that's a lot of fun and quite exciting. You also will want to join our roleplay revolution by clicking on the Discord link down below and becoming part of our community. There you can learn about the properties, follow the news on the various games groups, and get a chance to chit chat with me in the times between my shows. We do a games event on Saturdays for members of Discord, and then we also have our Sunday game for our Patreon supporters. So if you want to be part of a very narrow band group, we have a custom group on Sunday at 1 p.m. and you can join that by joining the Patreon program at the $20 levels. And I want to thank you for taking a look at all of this. If you have more questions, let me know at any time. I'm Jonathan Albin, Game Master J, and this has been Nikos Nightly. Have a good evening.